Today is March 2, 2018, and tonight we are going to examine the historicity of the story in the book of Esther. So before we begin, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you for an opportunity to get together and to consider some important claims about the past. Help us to be able to discern the truth, whatever it may be, and to learn every lesson that we possibly can from this. Thank you so very much. Please help us to be transformed to being the people of love who can really change the world. Thank you so much. Please guide us. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen. All right, so as usual, I'll make some preliminary remarks. I'm assuming that everyone here is generally familiar with the story in the book of Esther, and in past years we have had some investigations of the book of Esther and learned some basic things about it that are important to know. First is that there's actually two main versions of the book of Esther. One is known as the Masoretic version, and the other is the Septuagint version. Both of these books tell the same story, same characters, and so on, but they do have their differences. The Masoretic version is preserved in Hebrew. The Septuagint version is preserved in Greek. The Masoretic version makes no direct reference to God, whereas the Greek version does. The Greek version contains at least one dream and a fulfillment of that dream, kind of a religious type experience, whereas the Hebrew version contains nothing of that sort. Those are some of the differences. Generally, though, they all tell the story of a woman named Esther and her relative Mordecai, who are in the Persian capital in about the 5th or 4th century BCE. I think most historians would say 5th century, and during the reign of King Ahasuerus is the name given to him in the book of Esther. And generally speaking, what happens is that the Jewish people come under a threat, basically a threatened genocide, and through Esther's dealings with the king, because she had actually become the queen, though he didn't know that she was a Jew, but she ended up saving the day by dealing with the king very wisely, and Haman, the man who had conspired against the Jewish people, ended up getting hanged, and the Jewish people ended up defending themselves, and many people who were originally going to kill them ended up being killed, and that event became an annual holiday for the Jews known as Purim, which has to do with the casting of lots. Purim is lots. And so, and that has to do with the detail in the story. So last year, we questioned whether Purim is something that we should celebrate. And one of the reasons for this is because we came to understand that the idea of a scriptural canon is not in fact scriptural, and that every book needs to be tested on its own merits. So we really wanted to test the book of Esther to see what claims it makes for itself, and we wanted to test Purim to see whether it should be kept. And right now, today and also tomorrow, this is actually the time of the festival of Purim. Though we aren't necessarily celebrating it, but we're taking the time to look at some things related to the book of Esther. But last year, what we ended up concluding is that we really have zero evidence that the book of Esther claims to be a product of inspiration. So we really have no reason to think that it's inspired of God. The book of Esther does not claim that God established Purim or that the people are supposed to keep it in some sort of relationship with God or anything like that at all. And so we realize that we have zero evidence that we are supposed to keep Purim. And so, we really, at this point, aren't actually into celebrating it, but there are still some unresolved issues that we didn't really touch on. So the first thing is the historicity of the story itself. That's something that we haven't really investigated, and historicity is important, and I'll talk some more about why it's an important thing for us to investigate the historicity of Purim and of the story of Esther in general. And then some other elements that we didn't really specifically get into is whether, even though it's not required to keep Purim, whether it would be a good thing to do so and what that would mean. One of the elements about Purim that seems objectionable is this idea of time gifts. Victor Houteff actually talked about time gifts in a tract that he wrote called Christ's Greetings. It's tract number 13 in his series of tracts. And in it he talks about Christmas and birthdays and other celebrations that have as a major part of them time gifts. And he was opposed to the idea morally and talked about how it can actually be detrimental and promote selfishness and so on and so forth. It's rather interesting that he made those comments in spite of the fact that there's a book in, quote-unquote, the Bible, which actually implements a time gift related holiday. And so what we wanted to find out is if time gifts are an integral and inseparable part of Purim, because if they are, then with the principle Victor Houteff explained in mind, then Purim itself would be objectionable, and we should actually not only simply say, well, we don't think it's required to keep, we would at that point then have to say, we think it should not be kept, and Purim would be as objectionable as, Christmas or other such holidays. Just because it's quote-unquote Jewish doesn't mean it's automatically right. So that's something that we need to investigate. Or is it the case that maybe the time gifts element was a later addition to Purim observance, and that originally Purim had nothing to do with time gifts, and that maybe there is something there worth celebrating, even if it's not something that God specifically ordained. Maybe it's a question to be asked anyway as to whether it should be celebrated or remembered or whatever. So those are some things that we didn't really address yet. And I thought that for tonight it'd be good to start first with the historicity of Purim as some of the other things in some way are contingent upon it. And, we might think, okay, this is some proposed event from the 5th century BC in Persia. What does that have to do with us, and why does it even matter as to whether it's historical or not? Like, who cares, ultimately, And, here's the thing. It may or may not be hugely significant. If it turns out that the story of Esther isn't actually historical, then the implications of knowing its historicity or lack thereof may not be hugely important one way or another. But even then, let's say it turns out that it's not historical, it would be important to know, considering the fact that it is a book that is accepted as part of the Bible for the vast majority of Jews and Christians, and the Bible as a whole is probably the most influential book, definitely in the Western world, but maybe in the world as a whole, most likely in the world as a whole too. It's such a hugely influential book, and knowing whether or not this story is historically true has a bearing on the whole paradigm that most people have who advocate this book to be Scripture. So anyway, it's important to know, even if it's not historical. If it is historical, then this may be the first attempted genocide of the Jewish people, and can teach us a lot about human nature and the lengths to which people can go to wipe out another people. And it can tell us a lot about how people may arise out of such circumstances. And if it is really historically accurate, well, history tends to repeat itself, and there may be a lot of lessons to learn from this series of events, if indeed they are real events. Even if the story, by the way, is fictional, it's not to say that there's nothing that can be learned from it. There are definitely stories that are fictional stories that bear important lessons. Jesus' parables are just that. And, Ellen White recommended the book Pilgrim's Progress, which is absolutely it's not even historical fiction, it's just straight out fiction, and yet it has lots of good principles in it. So again, it's not to say that the book of Esther and the story of Esther can be of no benefit if it's not historical, but certainly if it is historical, then it impresses the lesson so much more, and not only has just kind of like moral lessons to learn from it, but also has lessons about actual reality. So, with all that said, I would like to start out by asking who here has spent at least a little bit of time looking at this issue of the historicity of the story of Esther. And so if anyone here hasn't, please also mention that you have not. And if you have, mention that you have, just so we have some sort of idea of kind of how the meeting is going to go. So feel free to speak up.
I have not recently looked at it.
I spent a couple hours today on it.
I have not.
I have not either.
Thank you guys, all of you, whether you've studied it or not. Thank you for mentioning. So in any case, even it sounds like the majority of people haven't really done much looking into this. And, we understand there are tons of things to look at, and people are busy and so on. Of course, we encourage everyone to look at it, but we know that not everyone can look into everything. An idea that I had, actually, not to get too far off, but something to consider is whether we should compile a list of the things that need to be studied, and people could kind of attach themselves to different items on that list, and then other people could look and see, okay, what needs to be studied that no one's really on yet? And then people can do their own research, and then we can all get together and discuss things and see what people have found, and maybe we can learn something from each other by that means. Anyway, we'll perhaps discuss that more another time. So I think I heard, Mary, you say that you did do some looking into it, and I'm not remembering if anyone else said that they did. So if someone else did, you can mention so after. But first, Mary, is there anything, obviously, I'm sure for all of us, just doing a couple hours of research on it isn't going to give us the final conclusion, most likely. But is there anything that you found that you thought was interesting, or that kind of moves in one direction or another?
Yes, I agree that a couple hours is not very much when it comes to this. So I did kind of find some things interesting. First of all, that it seems like there's no historians from the Persian period, that there's this historian named Herodotus, who's called the father of history, and he is a Greek, of course, and he's also called the father of lies, just because his accounts, I guess, are not particularly historically accurate, and the other Greek historians of the time are accounted as even worse. A man by the name of Cestus is another historian of that time. So the first problem is that, this is a story of a Persian king, and the only account in history that we have of it, besides the Book of Esther, is a Greek historian that is known to be biased and doesn't paint a very nice picture of Xerxes. But there is some, if there's any truth, which the things that I've been reading are saying that, if you can believe what this historian named Herodotus is saying, that Xerxes, the story of Esther starts out in the 3rd year of his reign, with Vashti, and then picks up again with Esther in the 7th year of his reign. And during that time gap, it seems as though Xerxes went off in some type of military pursuit that he was defeated in, and came back and wanted to receive comfort from his harem. And this is in Herodotus. His book is called The Histories, and it's in 9.108 through 9, which I did actually read. Quite a page turner. I guess this Herodotus guy is quite a storyteller, and I have to agree that he is. The account doesn't mention Esther, but it does mention his wife, whose name is, I'll spell it before I pronounce it, Amestris, Amestris. And she's supposedly his wife. He sounds, Xerxes in this account, sounds like just horrible. He wants to have his brother's wife. He wants to have an affair with his brother's wife. His brother loves his wife. Xerxes offers his daughter to his brother, and then something else happens. I don't know, where he ends up getting arranging a marriage with his son, and he falls in love with the son's fiance, who is actually his brother's wife's daughter somehow. And so he just sounds like he's quite promiscuous. And his wife is very jealous. His wife's name, again, is Amestrius. And so other, I was looking on some Jewish sites, they call the book of Esther, the reading of it, called the Megillah, which is, Megillah means just actually a tediously detailed account of something, which I will try not to do. But this word Amestrius, because, if this is written by a Greek historian, I guess that the Greeks would put these suffixes on these, Persian names or these foreign names. And, like, for example, for a masculine name, they would put the letters ES on the end of a name. Like Moshe would be Moses in Greek. And, even the name Xerxes is a Persian name because of the ending ES that is put on it. I don't know if that's true. That's just what I read. And so they're going to do the same theory with this name of Xerxes' wife, Amestrius. And before I get into that, I'll just say that some people are wondering if this Amestrius is Esther, because she would line up, although it seems like this historian named Herodotus is painting this wife as his wife from way far back, but that people are saying, well, this Greek historian is far removed from the location here, and he's getting his information from hearsay and everything, so he might not have known about Vashti to start with. But it is interesting that the consonants, in the Hebrew language, there's no vowels. There's vowel pointing that was developed in whatever century, the 8th century or something like that, that in most biblical Hebrew, that we have seems to have these vowel points. But I know from my Hebrew class that, modern Hebrew doesn't have these vowel pointings, and vowel pointings are for babies. So if we, which I still am, so I need them. But if we look at just the consonants in this word Amestrius, we get the consonants M-S-T-R. And so, like, Amestrius would be, like the transliteration of that Hebrew name. And some people think that those consonants are quite close, because in the Megillah, or Esther, basically, the consonants for Esther are S-T-R. And in Herodotus's name, the consonants would be M-S-T-R. So some people think that this Amestrius is Esther, although that's just speculative. And the case of this Amestrius is horrible. She becomes very jealous of this woman that Xerxes has fallen in love with, which is basically his sister-in-law. So she receives her sister-in-law as some type of gift, because there's some holiday where everyone is receiving gifts and giving gifts, and you can get whatever you want, I guess. It sounds similar to like a John the Baptist, King Herod type scenario where, Herod asks, he'll give her anything up to half his kingdom, and she asks for the head of John the Baptist. It's something really similar to that. And so she takes her sister-in-law and completely disfigures her, chops off body parts, and gives her back to her brother-in-law, who is in love with his wife. And so she sounds like a very evil woman, I guess, if you want to call it evil. I mean, basically her husband is having affairs, and the story is longer than that. But it's a very interesting story. I wouldn't say that it really comes out, really pointing for sure that this is a historical story. So, but I did find that interesting for what that's worth. That's it.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, it's, as I was looking into this, I came across a little bit of the same information, not a lot of the same, but the fact that according to other sources, non-Jewish sources, his wife was, however her name is to be pronounced, but someone, not Vashti, presumably not Esther, like you said, some people do connect the two names, but it seems somewhat speculative. Very interesting. Also, concerning Herodotus, yes, he's known as the father of history. There's another Greek historian. Let's see. I think his name is Thucydides. And he was born in, 460 BC. And while Herodotus is known as the father of history, Thucydides is known as the father of scientific history, because apparently he was more interested in accuracy and practiced a degree of skepticism and so on. But again, there is nothing like modern historiography in the ancient world. I mean, yeah, there's some of the motives are there, like even reading Josephus, he was interested in accuracy, but he didn't really have the methods of modern historiography, and the methods are designed to basically use scientific principles in analyzing literature to derive facts about the past. For the most part, literature. I mean, that's usually what is involved when someone is doing history. Although more broadly, I mean, archaeology is a type of history, and in that context, it's not so much examining literature, it's examining artifacts. So anyway, I wanted to just mention that as a side note on history, and also keeping in mind, well, I'll rephrase how I'm going to put this. The reason why I'm mentioning this more broadly about history is because understanding how history worked in the ancient world is kind of important when we are examining the question like the historicity of the story of Esther as contained in the book of Esther. We have to remember when reading any ancient writing that they did not have the same understanding of history, methods of writing histories, and just ways of approaching the past as we do today. And so we really should not expect to find any ancient writing doing history in the way that we would expect. And there's a number of reasons for this. One reason is that most people in the ancient world were illiterate, and so it's not like people just got their own personal book all the time and everyone just read their own personal book and that was it. The wealthy elite may have been educated and able to read, and they might read their books more like how we do today, but most people didn't read, and if they were to experience literature, it would be hearing it read aloud. So it would be an audible experience for them, and someone would be orally transmitting the written text. And because of that, I mean, it wasn't, well, I'll put it like this. Oral cultures have a looser sense of accuracy than literate cultures. Literate cultures are more into precision because you have something that's written in a certain way. Whereas if it's oral, well, you're not going to say the same thing exactly the same way twice. So it's far more loose. And even with literature in the ancient world was far more loose. than in the modern world, because there was no such thing as the printing press. And so every copy of a book differed from every other copy of a book because it was all written by hand and mistakes were made and so on. And so that results in a world that is just less concerned about accuracy in regard to specifics, because it's just impossible to maintain that. So you don't even, in that world, you wouldn't even think to try and maintain that, because it can't be done. When you're in an oral society, it's not going to be the case that everything is going to be exactly the same, word for word. So it's basically not even attempted. With literature, well, again, in the ancient world, it's going to be more precise than oral transmission for sure, a lot more precise, but it's still going to be less precise than in today's age. So when we're looking at any ancient writing, in this instance, the book of Esther, we need to keep in mind that it is most likely not the case that the author had in mind to give some sort of exacting word-for-word, letter-for-letter history that corresponds to reality, because they simply were not thinking with that level of precision. Also, this is evident in reading ancient stories, because very, very often the author just happens to know everything in the story. It's written more like what we would find in a novel today. When you read a novel, the author is kind of like in the background and is just kind of this omniscient voice telling the story, and they can tell you what's going on in the thoughts of the characters as it progresses. They tell you this one thing here, this other thing over there, and they tell you things that go on in private rooms when no one else is around, and then they connect it all together and present you with this picture, and you're supposed to gain an experience through it or learn something through it or whatever. That's how it is when reading a novel. When you're reading a modern historical book, the author lets you know their limitations and speaks frankly about, well, this is what we can know, this is what we can't know. We don't really know what happened here because we don't have enough evidence. But here, this is what the evidence shows. And these are the ambiguities of the evidence and the limitations of what the evidence can tell us. But as far as what the evidence can tell us, these are the facts. That's how a modern historical writing works. That's so radically different from a novel. Ancient histories didn't have those, didn't have a real clear distinction between those two genres. Ancient histories are still telling you the story like a novel writer of today. They're still telling you the story like storytellers. And it is, in a sense, more entertaining. It draws you in more. It might be easier to follow. But they're really telling it like a storyteller, not like a scientist investigating data. But some ancient historians did strive for accuracy, at least to some degree, and maybe to the highest degree that they even thought to consider, because again, they're working within a world that's less concerned about precision when it comes to these things. But, they may want to give a faithful telling of what happened according to the best that they know. So we just have to keep that in mind when reading any of these writings. We have to question, well, how was this written? Like, is this someone who's actually dealing with documented information, and are they telling us what the documentation can actually show and what it can't show? That doesn't seem to be the case in the book of Esther. You know, you don't really have the author saying, all right, so this part we don't really know for sure what happened. No, it's written like, the omniscient novelist, knowing what's going on in secret in this place and in that place, and kind of telling the story. But was this written in order to just kind of tell us some sort of moral lesson? Was it written as a fiction? Or was it written with the thought in mind to tell us about real people and real events? And if so, to what degree does the story reflect the reality of those events? So I know that I'm kind of giving some broad strokes here, but I think that keeping all this in mind is important when examining questions like this. So anyway, with all that said, does anyone have any comments or questions, whether in regard to what Mary said or in regard to what I said, or on the historicity of the story of Esther as a whole?
I actually did have one more comment about the historicity, is that in Ezra 4, verses 4 through 7, kind of talks about Cyrus and Darius, and then Xerxes, they think, in the beginning of his reign. This is Ezra 4, verse 6, when they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, and that it seems like scholars are thinking that this king mentioned here in Ezra 6, and I did look this up in the Septuagint. Again, I'll spell it. Actually, I'll pronounce it. It's I think it's Akhashirovash. They think that is Xerxes, and then there's a whole reason why, where they're going through again the transliteration of words and whatnot from Greek into Hebrew, or vice versa, and then of course there's the progression of kings here, that they think that this is Xerxes, and it does kind of line up. I mean, there's a clue there that in Ezra anyway, that during the time of this king, this Persian king, there was an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. The other historical things about the book of Esther was that there's that part in the book of Esther where there's basically like a postal communication going all over the place to different people and their languages and whatnot. And Persia, I did look this up, is famous for their postal system, that they were actually the first to develop, either with Cyrus or Darius, developed this postal system for common people, for just communication. Before, in the Babylonian times, it was just communication was for the king, but here is for everybody. So that part of Esther does line up historically accurate with the postal system in Persia that was developed at that time. And then there's an archaeological find that does, I don't know if I can find it here. There seems to be, I can't find it, I have so many windows open, but there seems to be some type of archaeological find that they found that looks like it lines up exactly. The queen's house is next to the king's throne, and the king's house, something like that. I'm just remembering it off the top of my head, but that seems like one archaeological find that does kind of back up the biblical story of Esther. And that's it. Now I'm done.
Okay, cool. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, and some of what I looked at as well, there were some positive correlations between how Esther describes, the Persian palace and what archaeology shows to be the case. And like even Persian words and terminology. So it's like whoever wrote it was giving some accurate information regarding Persia. So in that regard, it doesn't seem to be entirely fabricated or anything. Another one that's kind of interesting, and some people take this in one direction, some people take it in another. So the names Esther and Mordecai correlate with Ishtar and Marduk, and even like the Persian form of the name Marduk is closer to Mordecai. And so some people say, oh, this is just some like pagan story that has been transformed into a Jewish story, and it has to do with Ishtar and Marduk. But other people look at that same bit of information, Esther, Ishtar, Mordecai, Marduk, and point out that those were common names. And there have been several inscriptions found with the name Mordecai on it, not necessarily the Mordecai of the book, but there seems to be like a common name, that there were several people named Mordecai from that time. And apparently the name Esther, too, occurs more than once. And so, people say, oh, well, this seems to be lining up with what can be historically known from that time as well. Although, again, one could always argue that knowing which names were generally in use, wouldn't be necessarily an indication of the historicity of those particular people. Just like if someone today was to write a book, even if it's a novel or like totally fictitious, concerning 16th century England, they probably wouldn't give a name like, I don't know, Chad or something like that to the main character, because it just wouldn't necessarily fit. So anyway, those are some other interesting historical bits. I did look up some things regarding Esther just on the internet, just because I wanted to find some stuff that people might have accessible to them, although I did spend most of my time looking at other resources. But, even on the Wikipedia page for the Book of Esther, there's a bit of discussion regarding its historicity. And, it talks about authorship and date as well. Basically, usually it's dated from the 4th century to the 2nd century BCE. That's the rough range that people give for the Book of Esther. It seems to have been written, of course, after the events described, and most scholars and historians would say well after, at least by a century or so. But anyway, regardless of who wrote it, here are some comments from the Wikipedia page concerning the question of historicity. So here's what it says. The Book of Esther falls under the category of Ketuvim, so that's referring to one of the 3 parts of the Jewish canon, and that's actually what it says here on the Wikipedia page. The Ketuvim, one of the 3 parts of the Jewish canon. So you have the Torah, which is the 5 books, quote unquote, of Moses, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which means writings. So that's everything else. According to some sources, it is a historical novella, written to explain the origin of the Jewish holiday of Purim. Historical novella, I just clicked the Wikipedia link on that. So historical novella seems to be the same thing as basically historical fiction, a historical novel. So that's kind of getting to what I was referring to, that ancient writings, basically, ancient histories were historical fictions, or, based on a true story, that sort of thing, but didn't really have access to all the detailed facts to write a proper history in the modern sense. So anyway, this is saying that according to some sources, it is a historical novella or a historical novel written to explain the origin of the Jewish holiday of Purim. As noted by biblical scholar Michael D. Coogan, the book contains specific details regarding certain subject matter, for example, Persian rule, which are historically inaccurate. And I'm not sure if this is what it's referring to, and I'm not sure if it'll reference this later in this, but one of the things that I've read at some point today is that the idea that decrees made by Persian kings is irrevocable is only an idea that occurs in the Hebrew Bible. It's not found in any Persian sources or anything like that, and some think that it just doesn't really have a chance to be historical, because why would someone do that to themselves? And seems like an impractical way of doing things. Anyway, it's at least not attested outside of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, continuing on with the Wikipedia page. For example, Coogan discusses an apparent inaccuracy regarding the age of Esther's cousin, or according to others, uncle, Mordecai. In Esther 2, verses 5 and 6, either Mordecai or his great-grandfather Kish is identified as having been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II in 597 BC. And now it's quoting, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jeconiah, king of Judah. If this refers to Mordecai, he would have had to live over a century to have witnessed the events described in the book of Esther. However, the verse may be read as referring not to Mordecai's exile to Babylon, but to his great-grandfather Kish's exile. In her article, The Book of Esther and Ancient Storytelling, biblical scholar Adele Berlin discusses the reasoning behind scholarly concern about the historicity of Esther. Much of this debate relates to the importance of distinguishing history and fiction within biblical texts, as Berlin argues, in order to gain a more accurate understanding of the history of the Israelite people. Berlin quotes a series of scholars who suggest that the author of Esther did not mean for the book to be considered as a historical writing, but intentionally wrote it to be a historical novella. So again, that's historical novel. The genre of novellas under which Esther falls was common during the Persian and Hellenistic periods to which scholars have dated the book of Esther. There are certain elements in the book of Esther that are historically accurate. The story told in the book of Esther takes place during the rule of Ahasuerus, who has been identified as the 5th century Persian king Xerxes I, reigned from 486 to 465 BC. The author also displays an accurate knowledge of Persian customs and palaces. However, according to Coogan, considerable historical inaccuracies remain throughout the text, supporting the view that the Book of Esther is to be read as a historical novella, which tells a story describing historical events, but is not necessarily historical fact. Edwin M. Yamuchi has questioned the reliability of other historical sources, such as Herodotus, which is what Mary was referring to which Esther has been compared. Yamuchi wrote, Herodotus was, however, the victim of unreliable informants and was not infallible. The reason for questioning the historical accuracy of such ancient writers as Herodotus is that he is one of the primary sources of knowledge for this time period, and it has been frequently assumed that his account may be more accurate than Esther's account. Okay, so that's something that's in question. Whose account is more accurate? Is Esther's account more accurate, or is Herodotus' account more accurate? Is it to be that we are to take Herodotus as the standard by which to compare, or to which to compare Esther? Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, it would definitely have to be established as a standard, but like you were saying, Mary, he seems to be quite the storyteller, and maybe that's not the best way to go. Maybe both accounts just need to be compared with what can be verified, or both accounts ought to be examined to see what can be verified, and then go from there. One thing that I want to mention, actually, okay, there's an archaeologist by the name of William Dever, or Bill Dever, or Bill Dever. I'm not exactly sure if his last name is supposed to be pronounced Dever or Dever. I forget at the moment. But anyway, he's an archaeologist, one of the most well-respected archaeologists that basically does archaeology that has a relationship to texts in the Bible. And he recently wrote a book called Beyond the Text, I think. Beyond the Text or Beyond the Texts. I forget if it's singular or plural. Anyway, it is the first attempted history of ancient Israel in decades by any specialist in the history of ancient Israel. I mean, yeah, people have written on some specific topics, but no one has attempted to write a full history of ancient Israel in decades. And he recently did it, like it's a new book. And apparently in that book, he examines every story in the Hebrew Bible and makes some sort of judgment in regard to its historicity. And so I'm curious as to what it might have to say on Esther. But what he does in the book, well, actually, before I mention more of the specifics of the book, I'll just mention that he has argued quite powerfully that archaeology is to be considered a primary source when examining history above literary texts. The reason why, of course, is because all texts have to be considered, at least to some degree, secondary, but I mean, that's not totally accurate. But the text, when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, I mean, much of what is written in the Hebrew Bible is written as secondary accounts of events, not as primary accounts, not written by people who actually witnessed them, but much of it is written by people centuries or decades after the fact, and so then would be secondary, whereas archaeology, of course, is actually digging up the actual remains of the past and it's something that could be verified. So, for example, the Battle of Lachish is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And it is amply attested archaeologically. Like, archaeology really confirms that battle and confirms specific details of it. And, you know, like, the Bible could mention a ramp that is built. Well, archaeology could confirm the existence of that ramp. So things like that, it's like archaeology can really do a lot to tell us about what actually happened and could go far beyond what text might have to say. And one of the things that Wilde has pointed out is that, for example, there's an Israelite king named Omri. And in the Bible, he's just mentioned, like, there's just like a few verses that are devoted to Omri. But apparently he was a significant king to the point that for over a century after his reign, people referred to Israel as the land of Omri. Like, it was like a really significant, he had a very significant reign and dynasty. And anyway, Bill Dever says that he could easily write a whole book on the history of the reign of King Omri. And it's like, man, only a couple verses from the Bible on Omri. So anyway, what he does in the book is he first, like, he's a trained biblical scholar and historian and also an archaeologist, primarily an archaeologist, but he's trained in the other as well. So what he does is he examines first, he examines the archaeological data on its own and sees what can be determined just based on that. And then he examines the biblical texts on their own to see what can be established based on that. And then he combines them both in order to make a synthesis. And then evaluates each story based on that. So that's kind of impressive. I don't have the book. I'm trying to remember, Ed and Mary, if you guys have the book. But if you do, I wonder if you could check it out as to what it says concerning the story of Esther, or if it gets into much detail on that. But that would definitely be quite interesting. That book may be, it may be, I'm not saying for sure it is, but it may be one of the most important texts, if not the most important text regarding the history of ancient Israel presently available.
Yeah, we do have it. I haven't cracked it, but I will now. We do have it, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe if you'd be able, and if it wouldn't take too much time, it might be cool for you to kind of check it out and then see if it does have anything much on Esther, and, you know, if you could kind of skim it at some point before tomorrow night's meeting, and then you could just kind of, if there's anything that really catches your eye or whatever, you could share it.
Yeah, for sure, totally. I'll do that.
Okay, sweet. There are other things, you know, there are some Bibles, like the New Oxford American Bible gives kind of scholarly introductions to each book. There's also the HarperCollins Study Bible that gives similar introductions. And then there's Bible dictionaries. There's the Anchor Bible Dictionary, which is probably one of the most quote-unquote authoritative. It has articles on the book of Esther. Maybe tomorrow night I'll share some things from that. And, yeah, there are other resources that could be used. And then, of course, there's just reading the book. And even in just reading the book, you might be able to assess whether something is likely to be verified or not. Like, if you're reading something that's some big, major public thing, well, that has a chance of being corroborated. But if you're reading something and it's just like this private event and no one was there other than one or two people, and it's reporting things that are said in that event, then we'd have to question, well, how would the author of this really know what happened in that instance? And if there's a way, well, maybe it did happen in that way, but maybe not. What if there just wouldn't have really been a way? Or it's highly unlikely that there would have been a way. Anyway, I know we've been on for just over an hour, and we shouldn't necessarily keep our meeting going too long, so I won't get into reading any more of these bits of information that might have something to tell us. But does anyone have any comments or questions before we bring an end to the meeting? Okay, it does not sound like anyone does. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you so much for tonight's meeting, and we thank you for these principles of investigation. Just pray that we all take them to heart, not only in this investigation of Esther, but in all of our investigations of Scripture. We just thank you so much for these truths. In the name of the branch, he and she, we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and we look forward to continuing on tomorrow night. Have a good night.
Good night.